So we're going to go over the process from a kind of a high-level perspective. Then we're going to get into the specifics of a community selective cut. So step one of the kind of higher-end process, if you want to sort of lead this in your community, is definitely, and sorry, I should preface this by saying I've taken this from two sources. One is from the Ontario Phragmites working group, who have the landowners kind of kit of stuff to do, and one is from the Georgian Bay Forever selective cut process. So step one is you really, if you see a Phragmites stand, you really need to identify the land ownership. You can't just go on somebody's property, as we all know, and take out their Phragmites. So it's really important to verify the land ownership. Step two is networking. Hopefully you're meeting lots of people where you can get resources from. Hopefully you're meeting other people in your community. Sometimes you don't even know who's interested in Phragmites in your own community. We would also like to be a source of trying to connect people. So like I said, I would love to put up on our website different cuts, or who's involved in which bay in terms of being interested in Phragmites. So you can contact me and I can help spread the word, and we can kind of help each other. But this is one example. And you've got to think creatively. Now you're probably going to laugh at this, but this is one example of something that I did. My mother was having a cocktail party at the cottage, and I said, these are people that are going to be interested. And she didn't love it. She's kind of a right-winger, but she went with it. And I was able to talk for about 15 minutes, and I got 6 or 7 names of people that are really interested and wanted to kind of attack it in the bay. So that's the kind of thing about thinking creatively that you have to start thinking about. It's not an easy thing, but those are some examples. So step 3 is mapping, and this is a really important part of the piece. We recommend using this tool called EDDM Maps Ontario, which the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources has supported, because they're really interested in understanding where the leading edges, they're measuring a lot of different things, but where the leading edge of invasive Phragmites is, for example, as well as a lot of other invasives. Probably the most important thing in terms of the mapping is size and location of the infestation. And I'm going to go over that specifically. There's a reference where you can actually download these apps, and they're certainly on Georgian Bay Forever too. And if you don't want to bother with all that, just email me and I'll send you the links. But I've got to tell you, if you download these apps, it's pretty intuitive. I would not advocate doing it from a land computer, but you absolutely can. You can go to EDM Maps Ontario and do it that way. But the free apps make it really easy. And they have one for iPhones and Androids. You're a bit out of luck if you have a BlackBerry. Now, when you kind of go into the EDDM maps in your app, it's pretty intuitive, but I'll just mention a few things. You'll have to pick the invasive species. Sometimes it's known as European common reed, is kind of the common name. Usually you can get it from Phragmites australis, SSP australis. So you have to pick that out. It's going to ask you for a picture. And the picture is pretty critical, and you have your phone, and these are picture devices, so you just snap a picture. And that helps because somebody on the other end from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters looks at that picture and verifies, it takes usually about a week, whether it's an invasive or not. So if you're really nervous about a stand, they're supposed to be able to verify it through the photo, and that's why that's so important. Because you're using your app, it's going to instantly put in the longitude and latitude. Abundance will ask you whether it's single, scattered, or dense, and then habitat will be the other question. So whether it's near shore, whether it's on a river, list a couple of different things, and you'll have to pick that. Other information that they ask you, you don't have to fill it in. Like it'll ask you, can you give the size of the stand? So you can either estimate it or leave it blank. So you would wait, if you really are on top of this and wanted to see whether your sighting got confirmed, you wait for about a week, and then you can go online and see whether they confirmed your sighting or not. But it's really important to do the mapping. This is not what the Phragmites invasion looks like. It is much more prolific than this. But because they only started this about a year or so ago, this is what it looks like now. But mapping is really important. And you can use that mapping even with your own community groups, if you start one, to sort of assess what your situation is. You may get to the point where you want to work with other bigger groups, perhaps with municipalities. And that may require more sophisticated mapping, and then people like Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority, who this map has come from, who are mapping Phragmites, might be able to help you. The Ontario Phragmites Working Group is also kind of another good source for that. Step 4, it's along the lines of kind of step 1 and step 2, but maybe a little bit more sophisticated. Identify local resources. So depending on how sophisticated you get as an advocate for Phragmites, you might take this up in a bigger way. And I don't want to intimidate you and say that you have to do that. But if you do, you might want to be prepared to present a summary of your situation. You may be able to have to take that to these groups for them to get on board and able to help you, or they may be able to give you assistance in sort of being able to present a summary of your situation. So you can always reach out to Georgian Bay Forever. The Ontario Phragmites Working Group is another one, or the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. This is where it gets really interesting. So you need to determine the scale of your project. It's perfectly fine if you just want to work on your own land, that's fine. But if you wanted to take more of a community approach and you have a couple of community members, look at the scale. Is it 1 or 2 landowners that we're talking about? Is it small stands? Or is it large and there's really a lot of big and many stands? And that's going to kind of inform the next kind of couple of steps. If it's small, it really should be managed manually, and especially if it's in water, it's got to be through the sort of Georgian Bay Forever selective process that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit later, but we've alluded to it. If it's on land, there's a slight alteration to that process. But if it's small, I really think a mechanical cut is the best way to go. It's selective, and it's going to be the thing that helps biodiversity the most. And the timing, like we said, is pretty critical. So if it's larger, the factors to consider, which we've already alluded to, is if it's in water. Do you need many community members, like we saw with the Collingwood project? That was a big effort to, I think, try to pull together lots of people, and George is probably going to speak more about that. You need to you do need to do a manual cut because there's no approved herbicides in Canada in the water. On land, if it's very large, due to Ontario's cosmetic pesticide ban, you do need a letter of opinion. And I do have an example, if one of you wants to look at it later, from Nancy Vidler, who's a big person in the Frag community. She has worked on Lambton Shores, and they had tons and tons and tons of frag, and she worked with a lot of different organizations and groups and came up with a municipal plan. But you do need a letter of opinion if you want to use herbicides from the Ministry of Natural Resources, and then also professional licensed applicator. So I see this as kind of maybe not your first year. If you really get into the fight, you need to develop a long-term and a short-term strategy, and things that might involve are things like yearly budgets. So things like, and I'm not suggesting that you have to do this. I think if you do anything on Phragmites, that's really fantastic. But if you get more sophisticated, the things you might want to think about for budgets are developing pamphlets to hand out to your neighbors. You might need some tools. You might need some burn barrels, which we're going to get into as an example. You might want to, depending if it's a huge stand, get a still or some of the tools that you were talking about. So there's things to think about for a budget. You really want to, so after you've kind of mapped your area that you're interested in, you really want to kind of prioritize, like I said, those small young stands first. So talk about what you want to prioritize. I think we've talked about trying to consider the management options. Obviously, if it's a huge field and it's on land, probably trying to do a manual cut is just not going to cut it. You may want to work with different ecologists, and I mean, Georgian Bay Forever may be able to help you, but you might want to sort of identify if there's species at risk, if there's specific conditions. You might want to establish your objectives. I mean, trying to do it all at once may not work. So for example, in Woods Bay, I was really happy last year that we did one kind of cut, and I got a neighbor to do another cut. But there are actually 7 or 8 little stands. Now, it's not prolific there like Honey Harbor, but I knew I couldn't do all of it last year. And so next year I'll go and I'll tackle some more. You got to figure out your required manpower, and I have some ideas about that, but I'd love to hear yours. And the strategy for public awareness, I think you've heard some of the concerns, right? I think it's just a constant kind of messaging that you need to do. So we touched on this, secure funding for your project. Well, you can start a community group and work together to try to fund it yourself or as a group. You can request a delegation to council, present your situation to the municipality. And you know, that again is hit and miss. Sometimes it's sort of a 2 or 3 year process. Catherine did a delegation to council this year. She got turned down, but I think what it did trigger is a higher awareness level and a impetus on behalf of the council that they do have to establish some way that they can fund community groups for this kind of thing. So next year, I think that would be a fair expectation. It's not easy, but it's a continual battle. I will say that, again, on the Ontario Phragmites group, there's quite a few people to reach out to that are well known in the frag community. One of them, again, is Nancy Vidler, and she was able to organize a lot of different groups together and get funding for her project in Lambton Shores. So that sort of concludes the sort of higher end way of looking at it.